Greetings and welcome to today's 10-minute painting. We're going to begin here on a blue canvas which I painted and let fully dry. Now we're going to go in with a medium-sized round-headed brush and some titanium white paint. I'm going to begin working on the outskirts of our cloud and moving my hand in a bit of a jittery motion to ensure that it is always changing and evolving. It's also worth noting that my brush is fairly damp, which will extend the wet life of our paint and allow us to move the brush a bit farther with our pigment. Then I'm going to go back up to the top of the cloud where I think a lot of the light will be hitting, and I'm going to begin dragging that pigment back downwards into the center of our cloud. It will dissipate and begin to render a bit of a gradient from a pure white pigment to the initial innate color of the canvas, which is at this point a blue. Then I'm going to go back to my palette, grab a good amount of titanium white, and begin to reincorporate that, as you can see here. I'm doing a lot of the blending in a bit of a circular motion, which will give us a bit of a fluffy texture and aesthetic, and it'll very much resemble what we innately think of when we think of clouds. So from there, I'm going to take some more titanium white paint, and I'm going to add an additional piece to this cloud. Now, as you can see, there's a breaking point. There's a piece in between this portion of the cloud and the portion above it where there's a blue in between. That was intentional, and we do want that. That's going to give us a bit of additional depth, as it looks like a piece of the cloud which isn't receiving as much light and attention. So we want to leave varying openings like that and continue to rework in larger, brighter areas, and then yet again blend downwards in a circular motion. Here we're going to do the exact same thing with another smaller cloud to the middle of the bottom of the canvas. So I'm starting off with my outline, then I'm beginning to blend inwards. And I'm only doing this predominantly on one side because the sun is going to be on one side of the painting. In this painting, the light source is coming from the far right-hand side. Then I'm going to do this one more time with a third cloud. And I wanted to incorporate multiple of these so that you had time to really practice and get down the technique. Because I know sometimes we can try something and we get it, we love it, but then a week later we kind of forget the process. I hope by doing this multiple times that we really instill those ideas and ensure that we remember them. So from there, it's also worth noting that we're using a round-headed brush because it innately has fairly round feathered edges. These are fantastic for rendering things with a softer aesthetic, such as these clouds. Because if we were to use something like a square-headed brush with a sharp edge, we would get sharp edges. And clouds, for the most part, they aren't that sharp. They aren't a harsh line. So generally, when you're working on landscapes and painting, I would implore you to use brushes with softer feathered edges, like round-headed brushes, for subjects like clouds, whereas trees and rocks, things with harder aesthetics, will require things like these square-headed brushes. Now, as you can see here, we're going back in and I'm kind of moving some of this paint upwards. It's kind of flipping upwards. I'm trying to get a bit of a wispy aesthetic, and it's turning into these smaller little clusters of clouds. It's important to remember that we don't always have to work with just a single type of cloud. There's a myriad of different types, and generally working a couple into the same composition will really make the sky much more interesting. So we will definitely do that in this lesson. Here you can see that I'm beginning to work some real line work, some real movement into these clouds, and I'm blending it out. I'm making it very soft and transparent. You can make your pigments much more transparent by adding additional water to your mixes, and this is great to do here because the more transparent it looks, the more see-through, the more light, it will look farther away in the painting. So you'll be able to render more depth. You'll have clouds in the background, in the middle ground, in the foreground, and all of that will be decided by the transparency levels. I also created those clouds in the shape of a line because I wanted them to act as leading lines. They kind of direct the eye from that bottom cloud on the bottom left-hand corner up to our larger cloud, and vice versa. They ensure that the eye is always moving in between there, and we never get lost or move out of the painting. It's a very subtle cloud, but it does a lot for the painting. When you're thinking about rendering your compositions and your pictures, think about how different lines in branches and clouds and all of these different things lead the viewer's eye. The goal is always to direct them back to the main subject and not outwards of the painting. With that being said, we are now going to go back and reincorporate some additional highlights. This is something that we've been doing from the start and something we will continue to do. We have to rebuild up those brighter areas because acrylic paints generally dry semi-transparently. So as we apply the paint, it looks fantastic. It looks exactly how we want. However, as it begins to dry, we start to see the blue underneath it, and the pigment will optically look a little bit darker. So that isn't you going crazy, that is actually happening, and it's something that we can remedy fairly easily. All we have to do is go back and reincorporate those highlights that we put in initially. And by doing that, we are rebuilding up those highlighted layers. We are applying a highlight on top of a highlight as opposed to what we initially did, which was a highlight on top of a blue. So when we initially applied that white, we saw blue under it. This time, we'll see a fairly light white to bluish pigment under it, and every time you apply an additional layer, it'll get brighter and brighter and brighter. This isn't a bad thing though, because it allows you to kind of practice different things and try different things without rendering something too stark or something that takes too much of our attention. So from there, I did a little bit of a wispy cloud in the top left-hand corner. I wanted to ensure that it wasn't as opaque as our other clouds, but I did want a larger white cloud up there to kind of balance the painting. We had a lot of very large white clouds at the bottom, and the top kind of looked a little bit empty. So I applied those, and they kind of bend inwards. The goal is to kind of create something that, again, leads the eye back in towards our larger cloud here. Now it's also worth noting that some of these portions of our clouds are sharp, while other portions are fairly soft. You can use your pinky finger, as I've done a number of times in this lesson, to kind of soften things, and you want a good mix of the two. You want the cloud to have form, so you want it to have enough of an edge for that, but you can also give it a bit of a feathered effect because a lot of these clouds aren't actually that dense. We just see them that way because they're so far away. So giving them a little bit of a softer edge isn't a bad thing. The round-headed brush will do that to an extent, but you can aid it and kind of further that with the addition of your finger. So I'm also using it to blend inwards and make everything a little bit softer. You can do this with another round-headed brush if you'd like, but this is just a quicker and easier way of going about it. However, if the pigment is incredibly wet, be careful with your finger because it can be very easy to move and you might move it out of the way entirely. So it's very much one of those things where you kind of need to actually do it, actually try it to understand the amount of movement and pressure that you can incorporate. But once you do understand it, it makes the whole process so much easier. Now here, as you can see, we're going in and we're throwing in really, really small clouds. I'm using a good amount of water, so it's fairly transparent, and we're just trying to diversify it yet again. These are acting as leading lines, and they're also creating a cluster, which is fairly interesting. Now, generally, when we think of a blue sky with clouds, we think of a blue sky, but at this point, there isn't much of a blue sky left, and I think it fairly well articulates the mood and setting we wanted to accomplish. So don't worry about overdoing it. I would implore you to try to add and add and add, throw that in, throw that in. If you don't like it, that's fine. You can wait 5 minutes and paint over it, and you'll have your painting back to the way you'd like it. But the one thing I think that really stunts a lot of beginners as painters is the fear of failure, of messing up your painting. Don't worry about that. If you need to, mess up your painting and then fix it. It's okay. Acrylic paintings they're incredibly malleable. You can change them. You can fix them. They don't take long. They don't create a lot of texture. They dry very quickly. It's a great medium to learn and to try things. So with that being said, that is our 10-minute painting. I truly hope you've enjoyed. If you're new to acrylic painting and you simply like to learn more, there is a link in the description to my ebook, Acrylics for Beginners. If you'd like hour-long lessons just like this, I also offer those over on my Patreon account. You can get all of these lessons right now, and I post every Saturday. I hope to see you next Saturday. Thank you so much for watching, and above all, as always, stay creative.